Hi everyone, welcome to today's Monday afternoon webinar with Julie Wright and Barry Hoonan. We're all really happy you're here with us, ready to learn more about small group reading instruction. I'm Tori Bachman, an editor for Corwin Literacy, and I'm one of the editors who worked with Julie and Barry on their book, What Are You Grouping For? I'm delighted today to introduce you to two teachers who have taught me a great deal about joyful, student-centered literacy practices. Julie Wright is a national board-certified teacher, instructional coach, and education consultant with more than 25 years of experience in rural, suburban, and urban education settings. Julie has also served as an adjunct faculty member at Ashland University and University of Wisconsin, teaching graduate courses focused on curriculum, instruction, and assessment and instructional coaching. Barry Hoonan teaches 5th and 6th grade at Odyssey Multi-Age Program on Bainbridge Island, Washington. In addition, Barry works with teachers across the United States and internationally, including appointments as a 3-time Fulbright Teaching Exchange teacher in the UK, a teaching fellow at Harlem Village Academy in New York City, and Barry has recently returned from teaching in Brasilia. Julie and Barry, thank you for being with us today, and now I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Tori. Hi, I'm Barry Hoonan, and I'm speaking to you from Bainbridge Island next to Seattle on the West Coast.
Hey everyone, I'm Julie. I'm on the East Coast talking to you from New York, and we're really excited to dig into this fun and exciting work together today. To get us started, we're going to talk a little bit about the learning intentions that we hope to accomplish today. For the next hour, we're going to get stronger and smarter about creating, launching, and sustaining small group reading opportunities. We're going to take a moment and read through the learning targets for this webinar. I'll let you read on your own for a moment about the success criteria that we hope to accomplish together. We think that to get you set up for success, what you'll need for this webinar is maybe a notebook or some scratch paper and a writing tool, and get your thinking cap on and ready to go. We're excited to dig in. Here we go.
So fantastic. So the first obvious question as we begin is, what is a small group? So that we're on the same page, let's define a small group as 2 or more students. A small group is usually less than 6 students. So take a look at the picture before you and you see a couple reading partners or thought partners. And we believe a safe way towards stepping into small groups begins with just such a pair. And then as we encourage students to question and discuss things, we make our small groups even more dynamic when we push into groups 4, 5, and up to 6. Before we begin, let's pause and take stock by using a strategy straight from our own classrooms. In this case, we're just going to ask you, how are small groups going, what's working, and what's clunky about your small groups. So in your notebook, scratch paper, or as you can see on the screen, if you could share with us what's working and what's not, how's it working for you?
So you should see the results now.
Fantastic.
I think we can really concur with some of those results, don't you, Barry?
Yeah, no kidding.
We've been there in each of those positions.
So while you're jotting some notes, sort of an idea to tuck under your hat is when small groups are not working very well, or when they are, we use this exact strategy. We say, okay, what worked in today's small group? And what is something that we need to get better at? So in the same interaction that you're doing now as thought collectors and reflectors, we ask kids to do the same, taking stock. Some common challenges, I imagine, Julie and I have been working in classrooms and with teachers and kids, and teachers often name the challenges in the following ways. You'll probably notice some of yours on this slide. There simply isn't enough time. Schools lean into whole group because small groups are unmanageable. The whole issue of how do we manage a classroom with small groups we'll bring up in today's webinar. How do you work outside of the constraints of small groups being more than just mini lessons or strategy lessons? And how do you try to shoehorn guided reading into grades 3 through 8? Some of our solutions we've looked at is we really believe that the use of the workshop model gives kids time to work and read during work time. We'll talk about creating agreements and independent charts to set the course for managing or having students actually manage their behavior and expectations. And in this webinar, we're going to address the moving beyond just practice and guided reading small groups by looking at flexible small group arrangements that take advantage of knowing our students' interests and needs. Julie, can you talk a bit more about how we can organize our reading workshop to make time for small groups?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the pieces that's sort of near and dear to our hearts, because one of the challenges that Barry mentioned is one that we focus on a lot when schools and classrooms lean on whole group, because small group can seem unmanageable. And we understand that as practicing teachers. We've been there and struggled with that ourselves at times. We remember in past years where we had some of those exact same feelings. So the workshop structure pictured in this graphic makes small group learning possible because of the amount of time that's dedicated to work time. That's the work time for students. That's the time where students have opportunities to read and work independently. And exactly the same time, small groups have the opportunities to meet. Just as we suggest that you're taking stock of small group work, we also suggest maybe taking stock of reading workshop and asking yourself and mapping out how much time do the kids in your classroom have time to work. We believe that kids deserve 2/3 of the total number of minutes during workshop time. And so taking stock of that helps us make a goal to get to more of that time for student work time. Whether you teach in the elementary setting or in the secondary setting, you might want to consider looping your workshop across 2 days. That's the graphic that's pictured on the right-hand side. That would mean that you'd take 2 full days to do the workshop cycle. Doing so maximizes student work time and gives that time to connect learning from one day to the next. In that same spirit, we know that proximity matters, and the closer that we get to student conversations and kid interactions and kid work, the more likely we are to meet their needs. This graphic suggests that small group is our sweet spot for knowing and meeting students' individual needs, because we're close to kids, and the closer we are, we're closer in small groups than we are during whole group. For us, the sweet spot of small group is the energy that comes from students working alongside of their peers. To get started, we're going to jump into some 5 moves that we think can help reimagine and launch small group reading in the beginning of the year, and also that could possibly sustain small group reading across the year. So in order to do that, we're going to jump right into our first move, which we call Kid Watching 2.0. Kid Watching 2.0 for us is about being able to orient and notice and take stock and inquire. So we kid watch, just like the kiddos that we're watching in this picture here, because we believe it's the purest form of data, and it's the data that can significantly impact our decision making. We're going to come back to kid watching a little bit later, so we're going to spend more time. So we're going to move on for now. But one of the moves that we talk about that helps move a small group forward is the idea of kid watching. So we'll come back to that in a moment. The second move that we talk about, and when I say we talk about, we're referencing our book, What Are You Grouping For?, is we talk about pivoting into flexible groups. We believe that the more we pivot, the more teachers help create movable, flexible, nimble groups. It helps keep our readers moving forward as well. You can imagine, you know, many moons ago, we hosted small groups that were more static than they were dynamic. We did that because the schedule that we created, more times than not, in order to manage it all, each child had a day assigned for the small group. Those kids that needed that extra boost probably met twice in 1 week instead of once. So Barry and I recall having Monday groups and Tuesday groups and so on. And across time, we started to notice that really wasn't working for us. It didn't work. Kids needed the proximity of the teacher, and more importantly, they needed their peers more than once a week. So in our work, pivoting is all about changing up those groups regularly so that we can focus on students' passions and their interests and their curiosities and their habits and, of course, their needs. So for us, pivoting became all about helping small groups have autonomy to figure out when and where and how often they would be meeting. So some of that control or decision-making became a shared agreement between kids instead of us always deciding that there was a Monday group. So Barry and I, as teachers and facilitators of the learning in the classroom, our role was to figure out how we would listen in and then how we might join in small group learning experiences and when to do each. Sometimes we lead, sometimes we listen, sometimes we just stay out of the way. In our work, we thought through reasons that you might pivot or change groups up. We thought you might change it because of the curriculum and curriculum-centered reasons. You might change it up because of social emotional reasons, or you might change it up because of individual reader reasons. And if you're interested in learning more about the reasons and why those three options might be important, you can take a look at chapter 5 in our book to go further. The most important part about the pivoting piece is that sometimes teachers do make these decisions because that's what kids need us to do. And sometimes we leave it up to our students because they become key decision makers as we move forward with grouping. Our third move that we try to make is about assessing student work, because we know if we're looking at kids' work, we then can lift their strategies and their skills and their thinking. For us, student work is anything that makes students' knowledge, skills, and understandings visible. The fun part about student work is when you expand your definition, you know, student work comes in so many different shapes and sizes. Readers' notebooks, index cards, those have become some of our go-tos because they're flexible, they're versatile, and they're manageable. Giving students that autonomy that we keep talking about and the flexibility and making their thinking visible yields more success from what we found. This fun example is one that I love to share. It comes from a small group, a student in a small group who had decided to read a bunch of texts, short text, long text, different genres, different formats, with an animal focus. A few kiddos in the group read the book Runt by Marion Bauer, and halfway through the process, they decided to make their thinking visible by drawing an outline of Runt on the front cover and filling in the outline with significant events and details from the story. I love this example because I'm not sure I could have come up with this idea, that student autonomy is what made them start thinking and sharing and talking together, which makes it all the more fun and authentic. Sometimes we use journaling. So we want to be able to use students' work, like their journals, their readers' notebooks, because we want to crawl inside their thinking. We want to know, what do students know? What are they able to do? What do they need next? When we do that, we can use their work, we can sort it in different ways. We can kind of use their in-the-moment work, the stuff they're producing and creating every day, to guide our decision making. That student work helps us pause and assess and reassess, and most importantly, create a focus for instruction that meets kids' needs. As we keep moving through our moves, our fourth move is curating. We're moving fast because we're going to come back to a few of these. We're giving you an overview right now. Curating is the one that Barry and I get most excited about most of the time, because it's the time where we select and curate texts that inspire kids to want to read more and more and more. One of our favorite things to do is to think about what kind of text we want to curate for our students. We want to think about the text we want to curate with our students. Sometimes we're going to ask kids to curate texts for themselves, and sometimes we're going to ask kids to curate texts for their peers. This small group move of curating is designed to ensure that kids have the reading materials in front of them that they want to read. For us, organization is super important, because when you flood the room with text, you got to be able to figure out and navigate those. We've learned that there really is no one right way, so we suggest playing around with systems and structures that your kiddos like, or that your kiddos can come up with, and what will work for them and for you. We happen to like tubs for small groups, so that kids can share lots of different texts. We also like 2-packet folders have kind of become our best friend, because they store lots of texts. They're easy to transport, they're easy to individualize, and these folders can also be stored in the tubs that we just referenced. Our last move that we're going to briefly discuss is this idea of planning. So planning, is sort of the pivotal piece for us, so that we get down exactly what it is we want to do with kids. It helps us think about units. It helps us think about monthly and weekly and daily plans, so that we know where we're headed. For us, planning is pretty complicated, as you probably know for yourself. It happens to be one of my favorite things, because we get to put our theories about what we believe kids need into an actionable plan. So when Barry and I do some planning, we start by defining the what and why, which is the big ideas. We use standards. We outline our essential questions. We write learning targets. We sit and we think and curate beginning ideas about curating resources before we're ready to hand that over to kids. And then we work hard to try to determine student work products that we're going to use for assessment for and of learning. When Barry and I plan, we have lots and lots of fun. I hope Barry thinks it's fun.
Absolutely.
We pull our hair out sometimes, but here's an example that Barry and I did. I guess this was about a year ago, Barry, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Here's an example of a unit plan that we created together. As you may have noticed, Barry and I are 3,000 miles away from each other, so it's not unusual for us to plan, one of us with a computer and zooming in just like we're doing today, but seeing each other, and the other, talking through a microphone. We created this one together, and in this case, we used a whiteboard. Sometimes we use chart paper, and we like to use Post-it notes because it helps us stay nimble in our planning. We can move things around. When we know we can move things around, we take more risks, I think, and we're more in response to kids' passions and their curiosities. And their needs. Barry and I color code things so that we can, because we're visual people, and so we can see what we want to accomplish through color. That's just a trick for you. There's no magic to the color that we chose. We just, we know what they mean, and so that's important to us. Another example is one that's more like a little 3-week mini unit, if you're interested in doing some planning in this way, but 6 or 7 weeks seems too much. This one happens to be focused on nonfiction, where students were working the majority of time in small groups. Both of these examples are explained in detail in our book, as well as the process to use these. These plans, Barry and I talk to teachers all the time about how these types of plans are models to show the planning process, not standalone units that you should try out. These were developed with the thought process of specific kids needed this type of a plan. So often, Barry and I are asked, so you like small groups, so how in the world do I get started? We think that is such a smart question, because getting started is like one of the hardest parts. So Barry's going to talk a little bit about ways that you can jumpstart small group work right from the start of the school year. so that you get those small groups up and running and hopefully sustain them as the year goes on.
Thanks so much, Julie. You know, it's fantastic looking at your plans because it reminds me of as we get ready, set to look at small groups, what drives these launching small groups. And at the very beginning of the year, the question is, what should I know about you as a reader and writer? What are your literacies? What are the texts that you were excited about? And what are some that you would prefer to avoid? What are some of the interests that you have? And so when I'm looking at the plans that we developed over the years, the notion that we know what we're going after gives us the foundation for the small group work that we're going to do. So let's jump right in if we could. We have launching small groups, and then Julie, could you? We contend that small groups work best when students co-construct agreements and protocols. That students collaborate on a solution when the problems surface. Over 50% of our participants today are recognizing that have said that small groups are problematic. Working with people is problematic. So what we want to do is we want to engender our students in seeing themselves as both the namers of what it is to have a successful small group, as well as the responsible citizens that will react when things aren't going well. Because small groups, the waves, sometimes they're extraordinary, and sometimes we seem to bump into each other. Our current study, we're doing an argument study right now, and we're finding agreeing and disagreeing to be quite simple when it's an issue we don't care about. As soon as we elevate the discourse to something really important, we seem to collide. So we recommend that you construct some agreements. We found our classroom practice that when we get bogged down by monitoring students, not only does our reading workshop become clunky, it erodes our time and our focus in the small groups. So let's start the year by building these agreements into what independent reading time looks like, so that there's student clarity, confidence, and independence. Simply saying, let's create agreements with students that recognize there will be times we need to problem solve, and when our behaviors will get in the way of ourselves. So the first group that, if you're just starting a small group, we highly recommend this lesson. If you're looking at the slide, you can see that basically it's pulling a group of kids together and we're asking the question, what can we all agree is important in making small groups work successfully? So we place kids in groups of 4 to 5, and we ask the students to generate a list of how they want to be treated while participating in a small group. How do you want to be participating? So participants out there across the country, if you could just jot down, this is literally 15 seconds, would you jot down some things that you would want, how you would want to be treated in a small group? So Julie, let's time this for 10 seconds.
Sure. No problem.
Great. Thank you for indulging that.
Mm-hmm.
So students typically generate a list, talk about their list, and then to push a seamless review, we ask them to do this very important thing. From your list, would you prioritize 2 or 3 of your agreements that you really want to live by in small groups? We ask students to prioritize because it gives us another chance to look at what we think is really important. Then these small groups present their top 2 ideas to the class, and we vote on 2, 3, or 4 that we really want to be committed to. And you can see in the slide, that funny poster on day 1, what's most important are getting to know, learn from each other, is giving and giving respect, that we need equal airtime, and we really want to be the friend of the classmate we hope to get in return. In years past, kids have come up with things that They usually land on respectful, being kind and being considerate. The other little note is this first group that you can either be done in the service of a large group where you pose the question and the groups of 4 or 5 are all doing it at the same time, or if you feel the kids can manage themselves, you could pull a small group and ask the same exact question and act as a facilitator and listen in on the kids, what they come up with. If there's one lesson we believe addresses management concerns and issues, this is the next slide, I think, really addresses that. And it comes from the idea comes from a couple of friends, the sisters, who use it in the Daily 5. And you can see on the left, there's a chart there. During our first reading workshop, we really find it necessary to nail down what reading independently is. We like to begin with a student demonstration. So I ask a student to read silently in front of everybody. And we just take a 10-second pause and we watch the student. Then we, the students and teachers, we co-construct an independent reading chart like the one on this slide. Notice the success criteria. It's found under the words remember to. This idea of we are learning to comes from Shirley Clark, a wonderful writer for Corwin and a consultant over in Great Britain. And she calls it the WALT. We're learning to, and then the remember tos are the criteria. And this is what the kids have come, something very similar each year. You know, we get started quickly. We read the whole time with stamina and focus. We create our own personal space and we stay in one spot. Those are typically year after year on our chart. Keeping it between 4 and 5 is really sensible and it's easy to remember. Then I suggest that you have the kids go off and you have everybody read independently at the same time. After about 5 minutes, go back to your chart and ask them, how successful were you at getting started quickly? You know, we highly recommend you have students self-assess, because if you're going to get to independence so that you can have small groups, they have to know and they have to breathe and live in the criteria. So the thumbs up is, yes, I got started quickly, and a thumbs up, I read the whole time, and a thumbs up to creating personal space, and a thumbs up to staying in one spot. Now, if you haven't done this particular kind of self-assessment, there is no thumbs down. It's thumb sideways or thumbs up. Now, thumb sideways means I'm working at it. I know you've experienced students who are the thumbs down students, right? They're the ones who will contaminate your reading workshop through their behaviors. So we don't want anybody giving up. We want everybody either working at it, at one of these criteria or several of these criteria, or we want them spot on. So that gets us to those of you who responded. It's hard to do and manage small groups. So the next slide is, let's get going. If you're going to launch it tomorrow, what would I do? What would I recommend? And this next one that says cool stuff bags could either be a cool stuff bag or it could be a reading survey. And the purpose of the small group is for you as a teacher to lean in on a group of kids who have something to share. They've already prepared, and their text might be a reading survey. In this, in our case that you see before you, a group of 4 students are meeting at a table, and I've asked the students to bring 3 or 6 items from home that would say something about them. You will see, if you do this, that they'll reveal their interest and their hobbies and their passions. And as they're talking, we review a protocol. And I'll show that on the next slide. But so the idea is have kids bring in some things and talk through the text of their artifacts. Julie, will you show the next one? So in getting ready, I I create this protocol to begin with. Protocols can be created, constructed with kids, but this one was done so that we would get started quickly and we could replicate each small group. Now keep in mind, as this small group is meeting, the rest of the students are reading independently because they've already agreed on what that looks like and what things that they will do to be successful. So I don't have kids interrupting this little tiny group. Then I'm listening in and I'm finding out about what's really important to them. So they sit together, they review the small group chart. You can see the little cartoon that I have, what makes a small group work well. They name the purpose for the meeting. And in this case, we want to listen and we want to share our stories so we can learn about each other. Following the sequence of action items or steps really makes a difference for our initiating small groups. You notice in this particular case, it's not always, but I like to have a timekeeper facilitating. So the timekeeper begins by literally saying we have 2 minutes work on. After 1 minute, I'm going to remind you to bring it. I'm going to remind you that you're halfway through. And the timekeeper's roles change, or it moves from around the circle so that everybody has a chance to be a timekeeper. The protocol ends with the timekeeper who is last to say, who is organizing things, ends by saying, thanks for sharing today. I hope we're successful at, and then what was it that our job was to do? Today it was to listen and share each other's interests. And then they say something to the degree of, let's move quickly to our independent reading work. It sounds funny, but having this little tiny prompt it's the last word is the student, and they get themselves up and they move. During this time, on the previous slide, you actually see me taking a picture of the kids with their artifacts so that I can remember. It's very helpful when you get on in your teaching years to use pictures because they're spot on in reminding you what kids are really engaged in. So that's called Cool Stuff Bag. Next really simple small group that I want you to consider is thought partners. And moving from thought partners to what they call groups of 4. In the case that we have before you, students were asked to read short biographical sketches and then explain what they read to their partner. We had the 2 partners, then using a fishbowl technique, I had the 2 partnerships demonstrate to the class what it looked and sounded like to move to a group of 4. So thought partners in groups of 4 are really particularly successful when you have a mini lesson and you want the kids engaging in some kind of purposeful reading. You can see in the notes, we're focused on not only I share to you, but in the sharing out of the group of 4, the key component is I don't speak for myself, I'm speaking from my thought partner. So that the replication of thinking can be overlaid by that powerful listening that we want to happen in small groups. Then, if you miss something, your partner can interject, oh, you also forgot to mention that I was saying or I was thinking. So thought partners, groups of 4, a pretty simple way of jumping in to small groups. And the last one that I want to share with you is one that gets us all really excited, right? And it's the idea that once you have reading workshop up and running, that students are spending a good amount of time reading independently without interruptions, and that small groups, the procedures and the protocols are moving and working successfully. Book clubs just seem to be a natural fit, right? So what we want to do in our initial book clubs is we want to keep them short and flexible. How about starting with some short texts or short books when picking out book clubs? In a science study about biomes recently, we found some short articles on 5 different biomes, and we asked the kids to choose from the selection. Second, consider meeting 2 or 3 times a day. Consider meeting with 2 or 3 groups in consecutive days. These small groups can be highly effective in getting kids to name the kind of thinking that's going on, to surfacing important new information, and getting kids to talk and raise questions. So in the case of our biomes, what happened is the kids were fact-oriented. And so we raised the conversation to, did you know? Did you know this? Did you know that? At the end of each workshop to share our thinking. When kids talk about our book clubs, they mention that they're in control. So you can see from the sequence, we find some articles, we make some copies, we give them a chance to mull over the choices. We offer this time during independent reading. We create the book clubs based on what is chosen. So if all the students in the particular, the tundra was not a biome that was chosen, we go with the key interests of our students. We schedule our meeting times, and we meet to talk about what we're interested in, what questions. We schedule follow-up meetings, and we provide time during large group to summarize, and that's a really important part for the success of reading workshop is, what is that time when you come together and you name that stuff that's going on? If you don't meet in a small group, there's a real interest by the other students to find out what's going on in those small groups. Today I met with, I have 3 girls who are really keen on graphic novels. And we met for the second day, and a student walked over and said, when are they gonna share out their interesting and important information about graphic novels? And so that's the reading workshop sharing time that we like to debrief at the very end. So that's a sort of a jump into what small groups are about. Let's just pause for a second and reflect on some ideas shared about launching small groups. And as you do so, which ones resonate? Are you going to start out with a cool stuff bag? Are you going to have a reading survey where you can meet with a small group? Are you going to initialize some protocols for small groups? And are you going to create the independent reading chart so that you can manage your independent reading time? And the last one is, are you willing to jump in and try the book clubs as we organized on those slides? So Julie is going to shift us, and it's such a lovely, gentle shift, because she's gonna look at kid watching and how, when we watch kids, they inform us to the kinds of flexible groups that we can have in our classrooms. Hey, Julie, what do you think?
Well, it's, I'm listening, Barry. We've done so much of this work, but it's fun to kind of sit back and listen and think about, I'm thinking about those cool stuff bags for just a second, because it's such a fun way to launch small groups, whether it's the beginning of the year or the beginning of December or the beginning of January. The launch doesn't matter when. Launch just means kick it off, right? And that whole cool stuff bag, because kids are learning protocols and learning how to co-construct agreements in a small group, and how to share and how to take turns and when to meet and how to meet. That little structure can turn into sharing a cool book moment, or sharing a cool writing entry, so they can transfer what they learned in those first grouping ideas to other types of small groups with different focus. That's what I think is so fun about that, and because it can take you in lots of different places. So I appreciate you sharing all of that. The one really fun thing about all of that happening is I'm sure today, when your kids were working, you were kid watching sort of intuitively, right? So we're gonna shift, as Barry said, to this idea of kid watching. As you may remember, that was one of our moves that we talked about at one of our 5 that we focus on. when we think about the word kid watching, we first rely on what we already know. Educators have been studying kids since the one-room schoolhouse, and the word kid watching is not a new term. In the 1970s and 80s, Yetta Goodman and her work, she gave definition to the term kid watching. All we're doing is trying to 2018 it, I think, more than anything, to say, what does kid watching mean for kids today? What does that mean as educators, and what do we need to be paying attention to? Barry and I like to think about kid watching because it helps us ask really important questions. It helps us think about our kids and say, what do students know? What do they already know? What do they need next? For us, it's a way, no matter what kids we're working with, for us to capture kids' strengths and their areas where they may need a lift, where they may need some support. And that support could be in any direction. It could be something that they already know and you want to lift it further, or it could be that they need some remediation and you want to lift that further. We're going to ask you to kind of get your notebook and scratch paper ready, and just take a moment and make a 2-column chart. Your chart can look any way you would like it to. Here's an idea if you'd like an example. On one side, you can write down, what do you notice? And on the right-hand side, you can write, what are you wondering? So get your chart ready to go. If this structure is not resonating with you, one of the biggest pieces of kid watching is to find a structure that works. So if you have a different way you want to take some notes for a moment, feel free to create your own structure. Take a look at these two lovelies. Just take a quick glance. If you get a chance, on the left-hand side of your chart, just write down what you notice. Make a list of what you see. You can read the girls, the table, the background. You might have noticed simple things like the girls are sitting side by side. They have books in front of them. You may have noticed they appear to be talking. You might say they're looking at one another. Because you can't hear them, because it's a picture, not a conversation, it could lead you to some wonderings. So you're at a disadvantage just because you're not in the room at the moment, but you can still have some wondering. So on the right-hand side, make a list of things you're wondering. And your wonderings don't have to be for these girls only. There's a student behind them. Maybe your wondering is about that, or maybe your wondering is about the bookshelves or the pictures. You might be wondering if these two work together, or if they do it often, or if they are a new pairing. You might wonder if they're reading the same book or different books. Same author, different authors. You might wonder why they're together to begin with. What's the purpose of their conversation? If you were in the room observing, your notes would hopefully also include what you would hear. That's when your kid watching kind of goes on fire, because student dialogue is one of the most important things. So your kid watching notes and your wonderings when you're listening in, and even more so when you're conferring with kids, if you joined into this small group, it would often lead you to, like, the conversation would lead you to more kid watching, would lead you to more wonderings, because this process is continuous. Barry and I find that, your intentional kid watching, when you're actually taking note, you got a protocol or a note catcher or your notebook in front of you, that intentional kid watching forces you to sort of slow down and take it in, but it almost always feeds new inquiries and new interactions and new wonderings. We had to work really hard to figure out what it is we thought was most important about kid watching. While we give a bunch of examples of ways to kid watch in our book, We also think it's really personal. So use our examples as one way, not the way. For this, we put in front of you a kid watching protocol. When we use a protocol, we use this to sort of formalize our thinking. Sometimes we just draw this in our notebook because we find that that's the easiest way for us. Imagine studying kids during a reading workshop. Imagine just standing back and letting them get busy, and imagine your notebook in hand. We suggest to just orient yourself to take a pulse to what's going on in the classroom. You might ask yourself, what are the students up to? What do you see and hear? And why do you think it matters to student learning? Sometimes you can make a 3-column chart. You could expand the one in front of you and add your wonderings in the next column over. You could note your noticings. What do you see and hear, both academically and socially? You know, who are your students? What do you know about them inside school, outside of school? What do they do in their free time? What do they like to talk about? What piques their interest? Or who are they sitting with today? Where are they sitting? How are they sitting? Are they standing? What do you notice? We try to make room for taking stock of what kind of evidence that we can gather that can show us that kids are kind of knee deep in the opportunities for learning. So you could be asking yourself, you know, what are students reading? What story does their work tell me? What are they creating? What are they working on? And finally, with this protocol, we're looking at the inquiry piece of it, because kid watching should lead us to those inquiries, asking ourselves, you know, what are we wondering about kids? What else do you want to know about your students? This kid watching protocol can help you kind of take stock of all the rich data that's right in front of you every day. Barry and I do this fun thing with kids, which we happen to love. It kind of goes without saying that you can learn a ton about your kids just by interacting with them, obviously by conversations you have in small groups or just standing outside their meeting circle and listening in. But you can also survey them. Barry mentioned surveys earlier. We like to change things up a little bit. We like to ask them things about like their favorite YouTubers or their favorite singers or their favorite band. You know, we like to ask them questions like, if school let out a few hours early, what might you do for fun? Those are some of the things that are on the survey on the left-hand side. The survey on the right, we found a lot of success in because kids sort of make this survey their own. They sort of annotate it themselves. They put check marks or X's in places that we find really interesting. It asks them to kind of rate things like, do you like to build things? Do you love it or not really? Or do you like to color, design, and make creations? Do you like to be outside? To what degree? Do you like to pick groups versus having your groups assigned? My favorite is when kids want to weigh in on whether they want to stay up late, even if it means they'll be tired the next day. These types of kid watching protocols and surveys, we have several of these that are in our book, which we're excited about in a template section in our appendix. But most importantly, they're supposed to be a springboard for you, because you probably have some questions along these same lines that you already ask or that you maybe want to ask. And so making these your own is really important. So, you know, we can kid watch by listening in and leaning in. We can kid watch by asking kids to fill out some surveys. We can also kid watch when we study kiddos' work, right? So we think that like kid watching also comes to life in different ways when we couple what we see and hear with kids in action, by observing students in that way, but also when we put their work that they make beside them. So when kids read and write and talk to make their thinking visible, we can listen closely to what they're saying, lay their work next to them and get a fuller picture of what we think they know and what we think they need next. Barry and I call this the intel we get, right? We have this intel that helps us know what we should or could do next to support them. So these two pieces of student work are just examples of student thinking, but I think it's important to note that these are student thinking in the moment. You know, no one was graded on these pieces. Nobody was given a grade in Power School or grade book. They were just moments in time. The one on the left captures some notes that a student wrote while she was reading a short story from Flying Lessons and Other Stories. This student is sort of writing to think as she reads, and her writing is trying to make sense of what's going on in the story. She's trying to make meaning of the text by writing some notes. She's not only trying to figure out the ideas conveyed in the text, but she's also trying to make her own connections and sum up her own feelings about what the story is about. The example on the right is a little bit of a different type of work product. It's an exit ticket. It's one from a student who was participating in a small group focusing on texts, focused on bridges. She spent some time during reading time, reading a slew of materials about bridges, and taking a pulse at the end of reading workshop might give insight, such as this exit ticket here. This particular exit ticket provides question stems. I'll let you read those question stems on your own. After reading a short piece of text, the student filled this out. The questions guide the child to sort of unpack what's going on in her brain. It's a really good reminder, though, that if we want to know more from kids, right? If we want to give them more space, the more space we give them, the more lines or the bigger paper, the more thinking we tend to get, because kids sort of follow suit with what we ask them to do. It's also a good reminder that exit tickets don't have to be this structured. You can easily ask kiddos to write on one side of a note card their big ahas from whatever they've read or whatever they've talked about on one side of an index card, and then write their wonderings on the back of an index card. And you can get some pretty amazing takeaways of what you could do next based on that as well. We really love this quote. I'm going to give you a moment to digest the idea of a teacher's job is to engineer effective learning environments for students. Engineer effective learning environments for students. That's Dylan Willem. And we've sort of thought through this quote a lot. Excuse me, too far. Because Barry and I, we debated this quote a little bit in a good way, not because we disagreed, but because we wanted to understand how to put it into action, because we really felt like you can't engineer effective learning environments, if you don't know your kiddos well. So for us, it helps sort of kind of box in our thinking around in a good way about knowing our students and why it's so important to lean on our kid watching skills as our go-to for knowing our kids, so that we truly can engineer effective learning environments for them. So this kid watching piece really matters in small group, because you want to go from what do you learn about kids to how do you group them. So if the goal is to do just that, you have to observe and take note around what students say and talk about, what students read and what students write, what students make and create, which is their work, and what students do. You have to use all of that to make informed decisions, both with kids and for them, so that you can move forward. This particular note catcher, which we're not going to unpack completely, captures using what you know to try to form those small groups based on what you know and what you think they need next. So it gives you a place to noodle around. Here's a kiddo, here's what I think I know if I work my way across the chart from left to right, just to see if I can put it into action. So I'm going to give you just a moment to take a look at the headings on that chart. Barry and I weren't sure if we were going to have time for the curating section, so we're going to leave you with some nuggets. You're going to be sent this these slides. So I think there are some questions. Is that true, Jeff? We'll move forward. We'll leave our curating for sort of a take-home piece, and we'll move right to question and answers if that's what you'd like to do, Jeff. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have one question that came through. So if you wanted another minute or two, you could, or I could ask the question. My guess is we're probably winding down now.
Perfect. Great.
So Fran asks, what percentage of move to pivoting should be teacher directed versus student directed? What would be a good target for that?
Well, I think the whole idea of pivoting is what does the teacher do to respond to the information that they have in front of us. So yesterday I had a graphic novel group that I was talking about what was interesting about graphic novels, and what was revealed real early is that they were reading without naming the characters. I'm not sure the student could have pivoted because they need something to pivot and respond to. So in that particular case, we met today and we started talking about why is it really important when reading a graphic novel, you get to know the characters' names. And they mentioned, well, you wouldn't go to a party without introducing and knowing people's names. And the same is true of the pivot of knowing how to read a graphic novel. So,
Yeah. I think that makes a lot of sense. You know, I think the teacher intuition around pivoting, when you haven't locked yourself into a schedule, that Monday, Tuesday thing, or that every other week thing, when you tell yourself, I'm going to stop and pause and reflect and say, what makes sense? Does this small group need more time? Does this small group need to move on? I think you can size it up. You know, the most important thing about pivoting is not every group changes at the exact same time. So when you think about student need and teacher need, I mean, sometimes groups pivot because the curriculum is demanding us to have it pivot, or sometimes it's because of that social emotional piece we talked about, or sometimes that individual reader reason piece. So I think it really does depend. You know, I think what you have to say to yourself is, I'm going to give these small groups a go for 1 week or 3 days. Set a time frame for yourself, and then give yourself the freedom to either expand them or to shorten them based on what you notice your kids are doing and what they need. Barry and I are often, as we're wrapping up, I think it's really interesting. Barry, you and I were talking about the questions you and I are asked all the time. And so we were talking about the fact that that we're regularly asked about what should kids bring to the small group reading experience. Why don't you share some of our lists that we tell them about that? What are our go-to answers for that?
It looks, I'm looking at the clock. How are we doing, Jeffrey? I think we might be coming to an end, but it's a good place to issue out the question to the universe, so to speak, is what gets in our way with small groups? What are the things that we do so that we can be responsive to small groups? And the last bit is, how can we create a more student-led small group initiative in our culture?
Terrific. Why don't we turn it back over to the folks at Corwin to talk about the last couple of slides, and the 2 questions that we still have, we'll answer by email and send them out to everybody.
Thanks, Jeff, and thank you, Julie and Barry. That was really great. Just a quick reminder for participants, Barry and Julie's new book, What Are You Grouping For?, is available at corwin.com or wherever you prefer to buy your books online. Julie is also a Corwin consultant and is available to come to your school or district to deliver professional development workshops. You can learn more about that at corwin.com as well. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining in. It was great to be with all of you.
Cheers.